You know what finally made me stop and really think about how I work in my shop? It wasn't a new tool. It wasn't a technique I saw on the internet. It was standing inside a 600-year-old cathedral in northern England, running my hand across the arm of a choir stall that a monk had carved sometime in the 1400s. The detail was breathtaking: flowing leaves, tiny faces, animals hidden in the scrollwork. And this man did it all without electricity, without sandpaper, without a single power tool. He did it in complete silence because his religious order required it. No radio, no dust collector roaring in the background, just his hands, his edge tools, and the wood. I spent the next 2 years tracking down everything I could learn about how these monastic craftsmen actually worked, and what I found changed the way I approach every project. Today I am going to walk you through the specific tools, techniques, and working methods that medieval monks used to produce some of the finest woodwork in human history, all without a single watt of electricity. And stick around to the end, because I will show you a layout method I picked up from a cathedral restoration carver that made my hand-cut joinery more accurate than anything I have done in 40 years of woodworking. So when we talk about monastic woodworking, we are not talking about some abstract spiritual exercise. We are talking about a complete system of craftsmanship that produced furniture and architectural carvings that have survived 5, 6, sometimes 700 years. These methods are worth studying, not because they are old, but because they work at a level most of us have never attempted. Let me give you some background because the context matters. Starting around the 6th century, the Rule of St. Benedict became the governing document for monastic life across most of Western Europe. And one of its central requirements was that monks must engage in manual labor every single day, not just as punishment, as devotion. The idea was that working with your hands was a form of prayer, equal in importance to reading scripture or singing in the choir. The Benedictines and later the Cistercians built enormous abbeys, and those abbeys needed furniture. Choir stalls, lecterns, refectory tables, storage chests, doors, screens. All of it was made on site by the monks themselves or by lay brothers working under the same rules. Now here's the part that really struck me. Many of these orders operated under a strict rule of silence. The Cistercians in particular were famous for it. In some abbeys, monks could go entire days communicating only through hand signals. And that silence was not just a spiritual discipline, it shaped every aspect of how they worked wood. When you cannot talk, you cannot shout across the shop to ask someone to hold a board. You cannot have a noisy machine running while someone else is trying to concentrate on a carved detail 3 feet away. Everything about the workflow had to be quiet, deliberate, and self-contained. And I think that constraint, more than anything else, is what pushed their craftsmanship to such extraordinary levels. I visited the Abbey of Fontenay in Burgundy, which is one of the oldest surviving Cistercian monasteries, built in the early 1100s. The simplicity of that place will stop you in your tracks. No ornament for the sake of ornament. Every piece of woodwork has a purpose, and the execution is flawless. I also spent time studying the choir stalls at Ripon Cathedral in Yorkshire and the misericords at Gloucester Cathedral, and what I kept seeing over and over was the same thing. Absolute mastery of hand tools, an intimate understanding of wood, and a patience that most of us, myself included, have to relearn from scratch. The first method I want to share is the one that surprised me the most, and that is how silence itself functions as a woodworking technique. I know that sounds strange, but hear me out. When I am in my shop and I have the table saw running, or the planer going, or even just a radio on in the background, there is a constant layer of noise between me and the work. I got so used to it over the decades that I did not even notice it anymore. Then I tried something. I spent an entire Saturday working with only hand tools in complete silence. No music, no phone, nothing. And within about 45 minutes, something shifted. I started hearing the wood. I know that sounds like something off a bumper sticker, but I mean it literally. When you push a hand plane across a board in total silence, you can hear the difference between a clean shearing cut and a cut that is starting to tear out. The sound changes. It gets rougher, almost like a whisper turning into a scratch. The monks did not have the option of noise, and because of that, they developed an incredible sensitivity to auditory feedback from their tools. A gouge moving through English oak sounds different when it is cutting with the grain versus across it. A saw that is starting to bind makes a slightly different tone than one that is tracking true. In silence, you catch these things instantly. With a dust collector howling in the background, you miss them entirely. I now do all of my detail work and final fitting in silence, and my accuracy has improved more from that single change than from any tool I have ever bought. The second method is how they read the grain, and this is where you start to see the real depth of their knowledge. These monks were working almost exclusively with riven stock, meaning the wood was split along the grain rather than sawn through it. When you rive a log, you are following the natural fiber structure of the tree, which gives you stock that is straighter, stronger, and far more predictable than anything you will get from a sawmill. But it also means every piece is slightly different. There is no uniformity the way we expect from dimensioned lumber at the home center. So the monks had to become absolute experts at reading each individual piece. They would examine the end grain, study the run of the fibers along the face, flex the board slightly to feel where it was stiff and where it wanted to give. And then they would assign that piece to a specific part of the project based on what they found. A stiff, straight-grained piece of white oak might become a style in a frame. A piece with more character and a slight curve in the grain might be set aside for a carved panel, where that movement would actually add to the design. Nothing was forced. Nothing was fought. I started doing this in my own shop, just spending 5 minutes really looking at a board before I cut into it, and it has saved me more grief than I can tell you. You start to see where the tear out is going to happen before it happens. You start to orient your cuts to work with the wood instead of against it. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third method is about their toolkit, and what struck me is how small and deliberate it was. A well-equipped monastic woodworker might have owned fewer than 20 tools total, but every single one had a specific purpose, and every single one was maintained to an almost obsessive standard. For general stock preparation, they used wooden-bodied planes that are ancestors of what we would recognize as a jack plane and a smoothing plane. For joinery, they had a frame saw for resawing, a bow saw for curves, a set of firmer chisels in graduated widths, and a wooden mallet. For carving, which is where the real artistry happened, they used a set of gouges in various sweeps, a V-tool for outlining, and small riffler files for getting into tight recesses. They also used a tool called a scratch stock, which is essentially a small blade clamped in a wooden holder that you drag along an edge to create a molding profile. No router table, no shaper, just a little piece of shaped steel and patience. What I noticed when studying their inventories and looking at tool marks on surviving pieces is that they did not have 5 versions of the same tool. They had one, and they knew it cold. A single 3/4-inch gouge with a number 7 sweep can do an astonishing range of work if you truly understand how to roll it, how to change the angle of attack, how to use the corners. Most of us, and I include myself in this, accumulate tools faster than we accumulate skill with any one of them. The monks did the opposite. Now the fourth method is the carving itself, and this is where I just have to stop and pay respect, because what these men accomplished with nothing but edge tools is almost beyond belief. If you have ever seen a misericord up close, those small carved shelves on the underside of folding choir seats, you know what I mean. The misericords at Ripon Cathedral include scenes of animals, mythical creatures, and everyday medieval life, all carved in English oak with details down to individual feathers on a bird's wing. And they did it with gouges, a mallet, and a V-tool. No rotary carving burrs, no Dremel, no flexible shaft machine. The technique they used is called direct carving, which means they worked straight into the solid wood without a separate clay model or detailed drawing. They might rough in the basic masses with a large gouge, then refine the forms with progressively smaller sweeps, and finish the details with a shallow gouge and a V-tool used almost like a pencil. The key to their approach was working in layers, never trying to reach the final surface in one pass. They would rough out the entire composition first, then go back and refine everything together so the proportions stayed unified. I tried this approach on a small relief panel last winter, just a simple oak leaf design and a piece of European beech, and the difference was immediately obvious. When I carve the old way, trying to finish one area completely before moving to the next, the proportions always drift. When I rough everything in first and refine in stages the way the monks did, the whole composition holds together. The fifth method is finishing, and this might be the most liberating thing I learned. The monks did not use sandpaper because sandpaper as we know it did not exist until the 19th century. They did not use modern stains or polyurethane. Their finishing process was built entirely on the quality of the tool surface and simple natural treatments. A properly sharpened hand, plane or gouge leaves a surface that is actually smoother and more lustrous than a sanded surface, because the cutting edge burnishes the wood fibers flat instead of scratching them with abrasive particles. For protection and a slight sheen, they used beeswax, sometimes mixed with a small amount of turpentine to make it easier to apply. On some pieces, they used linseed oil, rubbed in thin coats and allowed to cure. That is it. No complicated finishing schedule. No sanding through the grits from 80 to 400, just sharp tools and a coat of wax. When I first tried finishing a project straight off the plane with nothing but beeswax, I was nervous. It felt too simple. But the surface had a depth and warmth that I have never gotten from any film finish, and it actually felt like wood under my hand instead of plastic. The sixth method is really more of a principle, and it is the mental health case for working this way. I am not a doctor, and I'm not going to pretend to be one, but I can tell you what I have experienced personally. When I work in silence with hand tools, something happens in my mind that does not happen when I am running machines. The repetitive motion of planing, the focus required for carving, the quiet rhythm of a saw cutting through oak, it puts me into a state that I can only describe as deeply calm. Researchers call it a flow state, and there is genuine science behind it. The monks understood this intuitively. Their manual labor was not separate from their spiritual practice. It was their spiritual practice, and I think that is something we have lost in modern woodworking. We are so focused on efficiency and output that we forget the process itself has value. I am not saying sell your table saw. I am saying that the next time you have a free afternoon, try working on a small project with nothing but hand tools, in silence, and pay attention to how you feel after 2 hours. I think you will be surprised. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that monastic woodworking handles completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for a power tool by default. Most of us do it because it is faster and speed feels like progress. But what the monks show us is that hand tool work is not necessarily slower when you account for setup time, jig building, sanding, and the mistakes that come from removing material too quickly. On a small to medium project, hand tools can actually be comparable. The second pattern is working with background noise constantly. I did this for 30 years. Always had the radio on, always had the dust collector running, even when I was hand cutting dovetails 10 feet away from it. The monks could not do this, and the result was that they caught problems earlier, made fewer errors, and developed a sensitivity to their materials that most of us never cultivate. The third pattern is over-sanding everything. We sand because our tool surfaces are not clean enough to leave as a finished surface. The monks invested their time in sharpening instead, which meant the tool did double duty, shaping the wood and finishing it at the same time. Once I committed to getting my plane irons and gouges truly sharp, not just acceptably sharp, my sanding time dropped to almost zero. The fourth pattern is accumulating tools instead of mastering them. I am guilty of this. Most of us are. The monastic approach of owning few tools but knowing each one deeply is a more honest path to better work. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. I learned this from a restoration carver who works on medieval choir stalls in English cathedrals, and I have never seen it in any woodworking book. When he lays out a carved design on a flat panel, he does not draw it on with a pencil first. He scores it in with a V-tool, making very light, shallow cuts to establish the major lines of the composition. The advantage is that those scored lines create a physical groove that guides your gouge when you start roughing in. A pencil line disappears the moment you start cutting. A scored line stays there, giving you a tiny channel to register against. He uses a 60-degree V-tool about 1/8 of an inch wide, and he holds it almost vertically for the initial layout pass, taking off just a hair of material. I started doing this on every relief carving project, and my outlines are cleaner, my symmetry is better, and I waste far less time correcting mistakes. It takes maybe 10 extra minutes at the start and saves an hour of frustration down the road. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time. Take care, folks. I will see you in the shop.